Jane is a longtime labor organizer, having begun organizing in the 1970s, first at the phone company, then as an auto worker, and at the time as a member of the International Socialists. She participated in their version of the rank and file strategy, which was based on an earlier Communist Party strategy in the 1920s and 30s. And Jane went on to co-found and edit Labor Notes and to write and edit several books on labor strategy, including The Troublemaker's Handbook, Part 2, and Secrets of a Successful Organizer. Jane is currently a member of the DSA Bread and Roses Caucus, editing their web publication, The Call. She is currently working on a pamphlet for the DSA Labor Commission on today's topic, the rank and file strategy. And she just left the screen. I'm not sure what that means, but patience, everyone. We're having this Zoom experience together. Hello, Jane, are you with us? Please unmute yourself. Welcome to Portland.
Yeah, somebody just knocked on my door, sorry. Wow. Okay, I'm gonna jump right in.
Great.
I'm really happy to be doing this. I like talking about the rank and file strategy, and I'm gonna start with a quick summary, and I'll flesh it out as we go along, but this is the summary. Okay, in the United States, we've got two problems. Many more than that, but we'll start with two. Problem one, the organized working class is weak. The level of class struggle, despite bright spots, is quite low. Unions are on the defensive. The proportion of our working class, even in unions, is very small. But without a large, confident, well-organized working class movement, we cannot even get close to socialism. Problem two, for historical reasons, most socialists, not all, are separated politically and socially from the majority of the working class. So what's our solution? The rank and file strategy aims to end this decades-long divorce between most workers and most socialist ideas by learning from and working alongside worker leaders to help foment some badly needed class struggle. And it's out of that struggle, it's out of active fights with the employers and sometimes the government that workers can come to see themselves as leaders and can be won to socialism. So how do we do that? Sounds like a big chore. It is a big chore. And it includes a number of tactics that bring DSA as an organization into close contact with organized workers and that enable DSA members to learn from their fellow workers. I should also say that the rank and file strategy was a resolution that we passed at our convention in 2019. Okay, so before I get into the nitty-gritty, I want to step back just for a minute, and probably this is not too controversial in this group, but why the working class? Why are socialists always talking about the working class? Is it because the working class is more oppressed than anybody else? No. We can think of prisoners, we can think of the homeless. Is it because the working class is more radical? In most times, not. Generally speaking, I would say students tend to be more radical than most workers. So it's not about current politics of the people or who's the most oppressed. It's because workers are the vast majority of modern society. And just as important, two strategic reasons, as our DSA educational materials put it, I'm going to quote, "The working class is the only agent that has a structural place within the society that can bring the power centers to their knees," a structural place. The working class is the source of profits. The working class is the goose that lays the golden egg for the capitalists. So if we aren't working, they aren't profiting. Or of course, some sections of the working class who do not actually produce profits also have the capacity to create a political crisis in society when they act. And we've seen this in the teacher strikes that were so huge a couple years ago. And number two, so we have the capacity to bring the capitalists to their knees, as we put it rather floridly. But number two, because we have so little power over our lives under capitalism, we also have the incentive to use our capacity to disrupt capitalism and ultimately to abolish it. The working class has an incentive to get rid of capitalism and have socialism, even if most people don't yet know that that is possible. So that's why the working class. Okay, so what is the rank and file strategy? I laid it out very briefly before, and I want to say that I think it's needed more than ever when we see the way the ruling class coalesced to stop Bernie in March 2020, just a year ago. You saw how quickly they came together to make sure that Bernie was not going to be the nominee. That and the fact that 74 million people voted for Trump shows the upper limit of what we can achieve electorally at the national level if we don't have a greater level of militancy and organization and class consciousness in many movements, but especially in the labor movement. You know, obviously we have to do electoral work, but elections by themselves cannot magically all of a sudden create big changes in the way people think and thus in how they vote. It's not like you go along being conservative, you know, never having the opportunity to be involved in a struggle for most of your life, and then every 4 years you're going to suddenly be inspired by a socialist running for office. It doesn't work that way. The work of changing people's class consciousness has to be done in between elections so that they're ready to vote for the socialist candidates when they come around. And it can't be done simply by politicians. So I believe the rank and file strategy argues that for us socialists, it's back to basics. There are no shortcuts. We have to find a way to drastically increase the level of struggle in society, but especially worker struggle, because that's where people learn and change. We attack the power structures. We shift the terrain in our favor. Now, I also want to say that I hate the name rank and file strategy. I think if I could go back in history and change it, I would. It sounds like a strategy for how progressive people should work in the labor movement, like, you know, business unionism versus class struggle unionism, or the organizing model that was talked about a couple decades ago, or the service model. It's not that. I spoke to a DSA member pretty recently that thought the rank and file strategy meant you wouldn't have anything to do with elected officials. No, that's not what it means. It is and always was a strategy for how we get to socialism. And yes, of course, it does mean changing the labor movement, but the goal is not just changing the labor movement. The goal is socialism. Like Jamie said, the rank and file strategy is not unique to DSA, nor to the International Socialists that I belonged to way back then. Other socialist groups had similar analysis and or practice. Both the Maoist groups and the Trotskyist groups both saw the same objective conditions, as we call them, and tried to apply Marxism to those conditions and encourage their members to get union jobs, mostly in blue-collar industry, with the idea that we could organize for socialism. So what were those objective conditions, which in fact still obtain today? Those are the fact, as I said earlier, that socialist ideas and socialists have long been isolated from the majority of the working class, and the rank and file strategy aims to fix that. There's a pamphlet by Kim Moody that some of you, he was a member of the International Socialists and a founder of Labor Notes, where he wrote, quote, "The left with its highly theorized, often moralistic politics, and the worker activists with an untheorized, pragmatic outlook are often like trains passing in the night." Still true. So although DSA has grown spectacularly, thank God, we are still small, relatively speaking, and we tend to come from just one part of the working class, the more educated part, the whiter part. We tend, again, many exceptions, but we tend not to work in workplaces that are central to the running of society, or where workers are in unions. So how are we going to fix that separation? Well, it would be great if there already existed a big, strong, militant, class-conscious movement of workers that socialists could just jump into and be part of. If you know, that side of the equation where I talked about problem 1 and problem 2, if that already existed, just waiting to be joined with the socialist side. But it doesn't. There is class struggle in the US, obviously, but we can't pretend that the level's high. It was starting to perk up before the pandemic, but the vast majority of workers are not fighting back in a concerted way. So that means the bad news is, in a way, that one job of socialists is to help bring such a class-conscious workers' movement to life. Not that we can do it on our own, we totally cannot, but to help. And that's a huge job. It's one that'll take many years, but also we have seen in history that class struggle grows in leaps and bounds when the conditions are right. And that's when you need to already be there in the struggle so that you can participate in the leaps and bounds. So, as I said, we don't do this on our own. We help by finding and working alongside a layer of worker leaders that's already there, who can be the leaders of a self-conscious current in the working class, conscious of itself as fighters. Those leaders are there, they're already leading some form of struggle. Maybe they're union stewards, maybe they're just the person in the workplace that the other people look to for information and for leadership. So our job is to work with those people. We can't do it ourselves, but I will say it's very true that if you look behind a whole lot of particular struggles, you will find a socialist there. Okay, so let me just say about this class-conscious current in the working class, that's sort of a formulaic way to put it. The place that I see that is at labor notes conferences. Excuse me, I tend to get choked up when I talk about this, but when you go to a labor notes conference and you see thousands of workers, and we were scheduled to have more than 4,000 at our last conference that got canceled because of COVID, 4,000 people who light bulbs are going off in their heads. They're saying, you mean I'm not the, you know, I thought I was crazy. I thought I was the only one that felt that my union needed to be changed. I thought I was the only one that wanted to fight my boss. And I look around and I see that there are all these people all around the country that want to do the same thing. This is the job that Labor Notes has taken on. Okay, so I said we're trying to create class struggle. Why do we want struggle? Are we just troublemakers? It's because when people are in motion fighting their employer, maybe the government, that we become open to bigger ideas, including socialist ideas about society, about ourselves, about our own capacities. Fighting the boss can give people a sense of being part of something bigger, the current that I was talking about that's capable of fighting, winning, and ultimately, and this is important, ruling. You could say that we need a class struggle movement as a sea for the socialist fish to swim in. If there's no militant workers' movement, there's no place for socialist ideas to get a hearing and for socialist organizations to grow. And of course, we'll never get rid of capitalism. So that's the rank and file strategy, to be in the working class, both as individuals and as DSA chapters, agitating for class struggle, educating worker leaders, recruiting to socialism, not standing outside hoping to be good supporters of something that somebody else is doing. We need to find the socialists of tomorrow, and admitting that none of this is automatic, that it's not automatic that people go on strike and they become socialists. No, you have to have people there introducing those ideas, and they need to be, you know, more widely spread in society, as they were to a degree when Bernie was running. But if we don't have that class struggle, we're nowhere. Doesn't promise immediate results at all, requires patience. It requires us to be in this for a lifetime. But that's how we're going to create a working class movement out of which socialists can be formed and socialism can be won. So how can DSA reach out to our fellow workers and find those on the ground leaders that already exist? We don't start off by bombarding them with propaganda. I've tried that in my youth. When I was in the IS, we sold our newspaper. It was called Workers' Power outside the auto plants in Detroit. That's where I live, Detroit. We had 22 regular readers, buyers at the Jefferson Assembly Plant on Jefferson Avenue. And I can tell you that it didn't make any difference. So not bombarding with propaganda, but a long-range view where we foresee working alongside our coworkers for years, starting with the shop floor issues that people care about, that they might see a way to win, and doing the methodical work, all those one-on-one conversations of helping coworkers to see that they're not powerless. I know that you've talked about these building blocks of organizing in your Secrets of a Successful Organizer trainings there in Portland. So the rank and file strategy argues that the best place to start is with unions. Why unions? There's a lot more non-union workers than union, obviously. But with 14.3 million workers, unions are the most racially integrated organizations in American life. They bring together people who would not otherwise have anything to do with each other at the heart of production, where they have to cooperate with each other just to get the job done. Plus, they are places to find workers who are already somewhat organized and thus in a better position to fight back. Even if your union sucks, having a union gives you more ability, gives you something to start with rather than starting from zero. Of course, we obviously have to organize the unorganized. If we only end up, if we continue with only 10% of the working class in unions, that's not going to work for the rank and file strategy. But, given the sheer numbers and given our small numbers, I think it makes sense to start with people that are in unions. So how can we bring socialists together with workers like those? And I'm going to suggest 3 ways, and hopefully you can suggest more. The rank and file strategy is often identified with one of these tactics, but really it's about all of them. They're all important. One would be DSA chapters build a relationship with union members in their city. Now that's not always easy, and I think some DSA chapters are much more, have gotten a lot further in doing that than some others. Some union leaders are not interested in having a relationship with DSA. You can do strike support when they're open to that. You can reach out to them with our campaigns for the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, PPE earlier in the pandemic, Save the Post Office. The Postal Workers Union has, at least one of them, maybe both, Jamie, you can correct me there, have been very forthcoming about trying to get help for other people with their campaign to save the post office. Here's an example. In Philly DSA, somebody gave them a name of some sanitation workers who were trying to fight for PPE. And one of their members, a teacher, just randomly cold called this name. And he brought that person to a DSA Zoom meeting of their labor committee, described the situation, and then the chapter assigned a couple of people to work with this guy. I think his name was Omar, if I remember right, to work with them on organizing their members to fight for hazard pay and PPE. And some basic organizing things, helped them to have a plan for outreach, a systematic way to track it, how to use social media. And they had an action. They had, I think, a couple of different demonstrations where it was the sanitation workers, but also other people coming out to support them. They did some phone banks. And then the people that they were working with, the DSA members were working with, ran for office and took over that local, which had been headed by a do-nothing sort of guy for over 20 years. So wow, huge victory. And then, that person then maintains the relationship with DSA and works with them on future projects. The person I interviewed about this said, as a labor committee, we were doing something timely. No one else was doing it. So here's DSA offering its help that nobody else is offering. The Central Labor Council's not doing it, whatever, to make a direct relationship with these workers as DSAers, as the working committee, the labor committee, as the chapter. I just got off a call a few minutes ago. In Detroit, we just held a forum for how union members in Detroit could relate to the Detroit city budget, which is a horrible police-loving budget. And we had a couple of a union president on and a rank and file teacher. And I'm not under any illusion that our forum is going to change the balance of power around the Detroit city budget, but it did convince that teacher to join DSA. And I see her as a future leader of our chapter. So it's those sorts of things where the chapter tries to create a direct relationship with unions or a group of rank and filers within a union. And as Jamie said, we're soon going to come out with a pamphlet from National DSA that has a bunch more examples of doing that. Okay, number 2, I already mentioned labor notes and some of the national networks that Labor Notes helps to sponsor, and there are other ones that aren't sponsored by Labor Notes as well. Labor Notes I consider to be the unofficial coordinator of the troublemaking wing, as we call it, of the labor movement. It's, for 40 years, we've been building this class conscious current. That was our goal back then, and it's our goal now. So those of you who are not familiar with Labor Notes, maybe we could talk about it more in the discussion or whatever, but Labor Notes is a monthly magazine that's, physical copies, it's a website, it's books like Secrets of a Successful Organizer, it's the big national conferences. And then of course it's the troublemaker schools. And I know you've had those here in Portland.
And we have one coming up called the Oregon Troublemakers School on May 14th, 15th, and 16th. I'll put it in the chat.
All right. And is that online?
Yeah, well, it's a Facebook page right now.
No, I mean the school itself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we're not in person yet. We are not.
So those are like mini versions of the big conference, and they usually combine some really nuts and bolts training, training people how to organize, like our Secrets of a Successful Organizer workshops, and bigger picture discussions where more political things can be brought in. For example, at the last Detroit one that we had speaker on the Green New Deal. Okay, but one of the best things about them is that they bring together workers from different unions, and you realize how often people don't get to be in touch with people outside their own unions. And it's light bulbs coming. Oh, you're facing the same thing we're facing? It's wonderful for creating this class conscious current, as I talked about. So Labor Notes also helps coordinate some national networks, one for teachers, one for nurses, one for postal workers, one for people in higher ed. And then of course also exists Teamsters for a Democratic Union. And there's one other that I'm not remembering right now, sorry. So again, that not just working in your own union, but creating those connections is a big part of the rank and file strategy. And that leads me to the third point, which is getting a union job, especially in a workshop that has influence in your city or in its industry, not just a tiny little shop, hopefully, where you can be part of all this. You learn from your fellow workers, you and they can learn the skills you need to fight the boss. I hope that many chapters will be getting together to pick priority workplaces that make sense in their city. I know you guys have been doing the job fairs. New York City went through a long process of trying to figure out what were our priorities. They picked 6. Detroit, we picked 3, which frankly, because of the pandemic, we've not had great luck with yet, but we're trying. YDSA has already picked out their priorities, and they've got a rank and file training school going on right now, where they're trying to make a pipeline for people from college into becoming teachers, becoming healthcare workers, or going into logistics. Okay, so I think I've talked enough. Tiny summary. The rank and file strategy is made up of several tactics that you don't have to be a union member to carry out. There are ways that people in chapters can very much, work alongside this, putting on troublemaker schools, relating to a local about the Green New Deal, whatever it is. And the goal of it all is to make socialists, once again, socialist ideas, welcome, common, normal in the working class, to rebuild that link that used to exist between organized socialists and organized workers. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. And now we'll get into the questions and discussion. Peter came in late, but again, asking people not to make commentary in the chat so that you can actually be paying attention to what speakers are saying. So put questions or stack if you want to speak in the chat.
While people are getting their questions ready, and people should feel free to put stack in the chat as soon as you have a question for Jane. But while people do that, I actually have a question for Jane. So I got a union job, my first union job about 1.5 years ago. And several of my fellow union members and coworkers are here in this college. I'm very happy about. And in my experience, I've seen it's very possible to promote like class consciousness and a fighting spirit and an organizing mindset as a rank and file member of a union. And like, for example, we recently did a reading group in my local on no shortcuts. And that was a really transformative experience. But there's a lot about unionism that I just don't have any experience with because, I'm so new to the labor movement. And I worry about becoming socialized to see certain business union practices as normal or the best way of doing things. And I think that has happened to some of my coworkers who are leaders in our union because, they're like very well-meaning people who, want to fight the boss, but they've like learned bad habits and bad lessons from the more experienced people in the room. And I feel like I don't have the judgment yet to know when a choice is just, the pragmatic thing to do or when it's just being like a pushover to the boss. And so I was just wondering if you had thoughts on like how to, get very embedded in a union that might have some questionable practices, but not like learn the wrong things from them.
Well, I'd like to see if somebody else who's actually doing it right now would like to come in on that first, and then I can maybe say something.
Is there anyone who wants to direct response to Laura?
I want to chime in. This is Alex Wise.
Go ahead. Well, Alex.
I'm actually in a similar boat. I also got a union job 1.5 years ago, and I'm struggling with the same thing, which is trying to figure out like what are like the good compromises and the good practices that come with the territory and what are actually business union things that we need to be trying to fight on. And I want to echo because I don't know the answer. I want to know what is our plan as, DSA and people who are practicing the rank and file strategy to overcome this.
Okay, well, what I have to say, I don't think is going to be very surprising. Number one is not to be alone. to be isolated, to be, the one person on the executive board when everybody else is more into business unionism, it's very hard. So first, if you're going into a workplace specifically with the idea of organizing, can you get other DSAers to go in with you and also be there? And, once you've been there for a time, does it make sense to have a caucus? People that you can meet with regularly to remind yourselves of why you're doing this. And going along with this, totally maintaining your connections with DSA and having spaces in DSA that you can talk about these things. Do you have a workers' circle where people can, bring these things? And this is so, not a new question. In any socialist organization, there tends to be, just because there's so much work to do, if nothing else, a tendency for the labor members of the socialist group to be less active in the socialist group and to be, more active in their union. And so, I'm telling you, you have to go to a lot of meetings and maintain those connections that can keep you on the path. Also, trying to find a mentor. I totally believe in mentors, people that you can meet with regularly. Doesn't even have to be from your own union, although that helps a lot, that you can, again, get yourself grounded.
Thank you so much, Jane. Let's go to Ted.
Yeah. So a bunch of questions, but my first one is, so in Portland, it seems to me that we have a situation where, we have a lot of local unions that don't necessarily collaborate that much with each other, and then are not collaborating much at all with DSA. And I think there's sort of a trust issue there, and that it's probably found amongst the elected leadership and the staffers, but probably not just there. And so you spoke a little bit to how DSA chapters can orient towards local unions, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how do we start to build trust with local unions?
Okay, it can be scary to just call somebody up and say, hey, I'm your friendly local socialist. Can we have a relationship? It's probably not going to work exactly like that. Again, it makes a big difference if you're in the union rather than, just calling from outside. Or the example from Philadelphia that I gave, the person who cold called the sanitation worker was a teacher. He was a union member, so makes it a little bit easier when you have that connection. So I think even knowing about what's happening in that union so that you can offer your help, is easier when you have the inside connections. There was an example, let me see, it was in Labor Notes, where a DSA chapter did a fantastic job of working with an SEIU local with service employees, healthcare workers, on a contract campaign for 6 months before they even went on strike. The president of the chapter of this local, he had run for office together with a slate of good rank and filers. They'd recently been elected to office. He was a DSA member, so he asked his comrades in DSA, what skills do you have that could help us in our contract campaign? And all this is on Zoom. So he gets together the DSA members who have skills with social media or with just organizing, how keeping a spreadsheet, all that stuff. And he got them together and they worked together for 6 months. And boy, did that create a situation of trust. And then when the local did go out on strike, of course, DSA members came to the picket lines and did all the things that, DSA chapters are really pretty good at doing. Now, in a way, it's a fabulous example, but it's maybe too atypical example because the DSA member was already president, so, that wasn't difficult to do. So I think when you don't have that situation, when you're starting more from scratch, you have to look at the campaigns the chapter is doing and see which locals they might fit with. Like, is there in your, I seem to remember there was kind of a progressive IBEW local in your area, correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe they were backing Bernie or something like that. And are they interested in the Green New Deal? You know, is that something that you can bring to them? Or maybe not, don't go right to the officers, go to some rank and filers instead, and better if they should bring it up, you know, then you should bring it up. Or healthcare workers local. Does anybody know anybody that's a healthcare worker who's interested in Medicare for all? Is there a way that you can work together, you know, with that union on that? But also just, you know, not just campaigns that DSA already has going, but, you know, what are they interested in? What's their contract campaign, et cetera. So I'll stop there. I hope somebody else can chime in.
Unless someone has a comment on that particular topic, I am going to read Marwan's question. Marwan says, how does the prospect of the PRO Act passing possibly change the battleground towards socialism in terms of the rank and file strategy?
The PRO Act would make it easier to form a union because I don't know if you know all the specifics of it, but it would make it harder for the employers. It would take away some of the employers' weapons that they use when they fight back, such as captive audience meetings. It would repeal Taft-Hartley as far as I can remember. It would make it more possible to do sympathy strikes and secondary boycotts. All the tactics that would help us win, of course, have been made illegal. So it would remove a lot of structural barriers. What it would not do is guarantee that unions are in a position to actually take advantage of that. Okay. Back in the, I guess, was it the 90s when we had that big debate over how much resources to put into organizing. Some unions put a lot of resources into organizing, and you know, they weren't necessarily always terribly successful because of the bad terrain, and B, they didn't always have great organizing habits. So I'm 1000% in favor of the PRO Act. I hope we get it. I'm not super optimistic we'll get it this time around, but it's definitely not sufficient. The unions have to be able to take the improved terrain and then run with it. They have to know how to get their own members active in going out there and organizing. You know, not all just done by professional staffers, although some of them are extremely excellent, highly skilled. But, you know, wouldn't it inspire, like UAW was trying to organize Volkswagen in Tennessee. You remember that a few years ago. So bring a Ford worker or a GM worker down from Detroit to go out and knock on the doors of those Volkswagen workers, not just, you know, people who are paid to do it. And I could go into, you know, many other tactics. So yes, we want the PRO Act. We also want unions that can take advantage of it. And sometimes that's not going to happen overnight. And we're going to have to work really hard to create unions that can make themselves attractive enough to make people want to join.
Great, thank you. Alex, were you on Stack for a question, or was that just a response?
That was just the response.
Got it. Okay, let's go to Brian.
Thank you. I had a brief comment, which was the first question that came out was about ways to kind of address or fight business unionism. And I don't think I have any kind of perfect answer necessarily, but I wanted to mention one thing that we've tried locally is in the bakery campaign for bakery workers, tying them in with a local union, BCTGM Local 114. Their union was decent, but had some of those business tendencies and was not super militant by any means. And we were trying to get more access for the workers also in terms of training for like shop steward training. So what we did was a supplementary shop steward training class that we put together by talking to other labor organizers in the movement and building a introductory shop steward class, and then focusing on kind of like the militant rank and file aspects of what a shop steward might do in the workplace. And I don't think we had perfect success because with layoffs and the pandemic and the volatile situation at work, things changed a lot. And as fast as we were training shop stewards, we were losing them in some cases. But I still think there's some room there to explore that, to see if we can do supplementary trainings with existing shop stewards to try to encourage that kind of militancy that we could see in the workplace. And the other thing I want to have as a brief question was, how does Jane and other people here think that we can increase the focus of unionism in the first place? As a bakery worker myself for many years, for decades, I couldn't have named you a single bakery union or named like 3 places in town that were unionized. And that was partly just my personal consciousness, I guess, as a worker. But I see that a lot when I'm talking to other workers, for example, at Amazon or other places. There's not a lot of consciousness around the fact that unions are still an important part of the culture in the United States. And I have a question: is anyone have any suggestions on how we bring that back more strongly into the consciousness of workers? I'll stop there. Check.
Well, if nobody else is going to jump in, I'm always ready to jump in, or almost always. I think the best way is for unions to get out there and fight and win. And when we saw the teachers' strikes in 2018 and 2019, you remember the teachers struck in West Virginia, of all places, my home state, I grew up there, and they won. And it spread to Kentucky and Oklahoma and Arizona. And then later, the Los Angeles teachers and the Chicago teachers also went on strike. And so people saw the power of a good example. I just think that's absolutely now easier said than done, that unions should do that. Or maybe many people have heard this quote. I've quoted it many times myself. In 1997, UPS, the largest union contract in the private sector in the United States, I think 200,000 workers, some very large number, went on strike. And their campaign was also oriented, their campaign was oriented to stopping UPS's profits, which they did extremely well. But they also had a public-facing campaign to say, this is about UPS, over half of our members here are part-time. Part-time America doesn't work. That was their slogan. And they won that strike. And after that strike, lo and behold, the Teamsters start getting all kinds of calls from FedEx workers who want a union because they saw that a union is a good thing and it can win. And even John Sweeney, the president of the AFL-CIO, says, we could make a zillion house calls and 100,000 rallies and blah, 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 and nothing does for organizing what the UPS strike did for organizing. So that's how to get unions into the public consciousness.
Gonna go to Ted for direct response.
Yeah, and another thing I'd add on is this morning I was just in DSLC training on how to talk to union members, but also how to talk to your coworkers about the PRO Act. And I think with the PRO Act, it's a really good opportunity to be having conversations with the people that we work with, whether you have a union or not, about doing some education about how hard it is right now to form a union and how unjust that is, and how, having a union is like a basic human right that we should be fighting for. So I think using education around the PRO Act to raise people's expectations is one way. Of course, it depends on whether someone cares about it. You have to find a way to hook them into the conversation, but I think that's another thing we can do.
Okay, next is Jesse D.
Thank you.
You missed Ted. Nick.
No, Nick is after. Nick is after.
Oh, sorry.
Jesse.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. And Jane, for bringing up 97. I just want to say, RIP to a real one, Ron Carey, a true hero of the working class. My question concerns a specific situation here in Oregon that we have. One of our largest public sector unions, SEIU 503, is a statewide megalocal. How can the rank and file strategy attack this SEIU megalocal model where you can perhaps get your hands on the steering wheel in one part of the state, but it's very difficult to kind of create the structure to steer the ship statewide? Because there are, for example, 72,000 people in that union all across Oregon. So, and that's pretty much every single public sector state job and DMV, DHS, all that stuff. Like, how can you effectively create a rank and file strategy for the mega local? Check.
Oh man, that's a hard one. And I think the mega locals were created so that they could be more easily controlled, partly. I don't want to say that was the only reason, and they exist all over the country, as you know. And I don't have a magic solution for that. I wish I did. I mean, it's reaching out to the people that are not your closest. You're in the health department, you reach out to the DMV, you find the people all over, you start small, you grow up. I don't know. Anybody got anything more brilliant to say than that?
Jamie, go ahead.
Yeah, two things. One is that everybody is in a workplace, however small or large. And so you organize in that workplace, you become the shop steward, you organize direct actions, you build the confidence of the people you're with. But then beyond, and people, in your union hear about this, and they're like, they start calling you and like, what are you doing? And then of course the caucus. And Jane, you haven't really talked too much about building rank and file caucuses, but that's basically how they start, either through shop floor actions or something like what the Chicago Teachers Union core started with community, the fight against school closures. Yeah. Can we talk some more about caucuses and when and how and to form them?
Well, I think ideally a caucus is not formed just to run for office. People who have good ideas and they think the people who are in there now don't have good ideas, vote for us, we'll do better. Much better, as Jamie was saying, if you start with some struggle over workplace issues that people actually care about, because, face it, most people are not paying super amount of attention to what their union leaders are doing on any given day, but they do care about whether they're going to get their break on any given day. So, and this is part of the answer to the previous question also, it's, just elaborating on what Jamie was saying is back to basics, organizing around things that affect people's daily lives on the job and that might be winnable, that involve tactics that make them see each other acting like a march on the boss. And then once you get a reputation for being somebody that is willing to stand up, that's when it might make sense to actually start talking to people about running for office, forming a caucus to do that. And you don't expect to necessarily win on your first time. The Chicago teachers, totally unusual that they ran the very first time they ran for office. They'd only been in existence 2 years and they took over the third largest teachers union in the country. In Los Angeles, teachers they organized for 22 years, literally, before they took power in that local. So, yeah, I really, and I'll give a negative example. Too often in the union that I know best, the auto workers, I've seen people just think it was all about elections, and they're not talking about fighting the boss on the shop floor, and they don't usually win.
Megan had a direct response. Go ahead.
Jane and Jane and Jamie, I think, covered what I was going to say. I mean, I really think with SEIU 503 and the mega locals, you got to break it down into chunks and focus on the smaller sublocals. And I think that's why it's so important that we do these events like the Oregon Troublemaker Schools and the rank and file strategy kind of work that we're talking about in DSA, because we need to, in order to do that, we need to ID like-minded folks in those locals. So you could link up with the right people to get it done. It's kind of hard the way people are separated these days. But I think there are some good examples of wins that you can achieve in between contract bargaining, because it's hard to influence the state worker contract bargaining process. It's hard to influence general counsel, although I think it's doable. And I think, Laura, if we get a chance, you should go on Stack to talk, Laura and Holly, to talk about the internet campaign, because I think that's a great example of IDing an issue that had some heat in between contracts. And I think it's a great example of rank and file strategy, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Let me just jump in and say, I agree with all that. A troublemaker school can be a great place to hook people up with each other. Have, during lunchtime, have a meeting just for SEIU 503 members. And, even if there's only 3 of them, but they're in different parts, they can start talking to each other. And I'll just mention that example I gave of the DSA chapter in the East Bay in California, who worked with the SEIU local. That local, I think it has 50,000 members. It's 10 to 1 is its name. This was one chapter of that local. Okay, so they broke off a chunk and they worked with that chapter and worked great.
Keith, for direct response.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry if I'm a little slow in my response. I didn't get any sleep and I just came off a 10-hour shift at Amazon. I had some experience working with SEIU 775 in Washington State and SEIU 503 in Oregon State in relation to a $15 minimum wage campaign in 2014, 2015. And, I can't say for sure, how do we finally address the SEIU mega local issue, or how do we take them over or neutralize their power? But I can say just a brief lesson is that, SEIU really took notice of these movements in a way I think the movements weren't expecting. It's a lot of young activists, firebrands ready to make change. And I don't think they really expected that SEIU would, SEIU really reached out to them and essentially wanted to, and was sort of successful in co-opting those movements and making sure they were watered down. Why SEIU did this, its motivations, I don't know, speculation. But I can say that it really was that they got the people who were running these $15 minimum wage movements to sit down at the same table as SEIU, and SEIU at that table, even though there might have been city councilors or state legislators, SEIU's president's voice was the most powerful voice in the room. And they essentially, got the socialists to go along with their more watered down versions. In Oregon, we still don't have a $15 minimum wage. They watered down to make it $14.75 for the Portland Metro in 2 years from now, even though it passed in 2016. So, and in Seattle, they had a 7-year phase and it's still not there quite yet. So I would just say that watch out for these unions, because they do, like, when you try to organize workers, even just for a sort of political reform of raising the minimum wage, SEIU and big labor unions see that as a threat. They see that as a challenge to their hegemony over, working class issues and leading the working class. And they take interest and they're very powerful and they can co-opt your movements, and they have, from my experience. So just experience I thought I'd share.
Have a quick jerk response from Jesse D, and then we're going to go back to our question stack. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, apologies to stretch this one out so much, folks, but I think that the caucus answer, is obviously good, but if I'm not mistaken, like historically in SEIU 503, that caucus strategy has been tried, and one of the people who was elected to a specific position in the e-board, became an hostile opposition to the caucus after the fact. So like, I'm just saying that like, it's great to like form these caucuses. It's important to like, have like a direct connection to like, the workers and like, their labor leadership. That's a more like, hostile approach, or, not hostile, adversarial to a degree, one that like, actually leads to like, some conflict that could generate the leadership to go in a good direction. So I'm just not saying, I just want to caution that like, it's going to take a lot of struggle and organizing, and not just like, the formation of a caucus to do that. Thank you. Check.
Okay, next question from Nick.
Yeah, I kind of apologize. There's been some really good discussion just in the last few minutes, so it kind of scrambled my brain on what my question was going to be. But I wanted to say something before I got to my question on this idea of the caucus and, taking up struggle within the union and union co-optation and all these things. I had a comrade that was in my old chapter who talked about, as a rank and file worker, when you're taking up these struggles, like the contests for power are important. Right, the conflict that you can foment between the workers and the boss is important, and the goals that you try to achieve, those are all important. But what's equally important is trying to create an ideological home for socialism within your union and within the workers that are around you, because these ideas of class struggle and class conflict, they come up naturally. The ideas of socialism, the ideas of Marxism come from labor-related struggle. And so people will start to think about these things when they're in conflict with their employer, or when they're in conflict with somebody else who holds power over them in society. And so as a socialist, if you're there to help provide some context into why these things are happening, that even if you don't win the bigger fight right away, right, you don't win that first struggle, if you're creating an ideological home for people to start to understand some of the forces that they're working against, that can be just as powerful as achieving your initial objectives. So that's something that I wanted to share that really found resonance with me when my comrade talked about it. I just started working at UPS 2 weeks ago. I finished my second week as the lowest possible level worker, the guy that puts the packages in the truck. And just like when I was union organizing, I found that to be a very clarifying experience politically. I found working as a manual laborer in a factory at 3 o'clock in the morning to be very ideologically clarifying as well. So that's something that I think is great about the rank and file strategy, is it kind of demystifies the whole socialist politics a little bit. It's like, oh, wow, I put a bike in a truck, and the shipping on that bike probably cost about as much as I'm going to make today. And that's one of 900 packages I'm loading. So something that I did want to ask, though, is, right now I'm just a pain in the neck for all the workers that are around me, because I'm new and I keep screwing things up and going too slow. And so people are being nice and they're helping me out. But as I get better at it, what can I do to start to bring, some kind of workplace struggle or like basic organizing, what are the things that I can be looking for as a worker who wants to start organizing in a very big, unfamiliar workplace? What are some of the first steps I can identify, and just practical advice from people I know that have been in those contexts before? Thank you. Check.
Let's let somebody else talk. I'm talking so much. Somebody else answer that question.
I think Megan, did you wanna comment?
Oh, my response wasn't related to Nick. It was to Jesse, I think. But I think that Nick is posing very good questions. I'm curious for others who have more experience working in the larger factory type settings. I think it's a good question.
Let's go to Brian and then Ted.
Thanks. I'll say that briefly. The experience that I had working at Amazon on the night shift there, as a new person, also same thing, trying to figure out how to get connected and how to start doing work on the site. I did a lot of workplace mapping, where I basically just started figuring out what's everybody's names, what are their roles, and then I'm just trying to find the organic leaders is a big part of that too. And just very briefly, I'm searching for the existing structures inside of the people who have the power of a shop steward, but are doing that for themselves or for their buddies at work or whatever else. And I'm looking to subvert that system, basically. Because I'm trying to find out who are the organic leaders that already get what they want from the bosses just by asking, or because they've found a niche where they're indispensable, or just because they're good with people, right? And have those skills. And how am I going to get them on my side? At least, the very least, make them, they're not going to fight me in my work. But I'm more hopefully, I want to convert them to my side. So because that organic leader network is going to be the key to how I'm going to change things at work if I want to change conditions, right? Because they're going to know how to do the workplace. Like, they're going to know how to do malicious compliance. They're going to know how to do all the things that basically workers already know how to do when they hate the boss, right? When the boss is dicking them over. And they're also going to be the people who know the structures already in place and who can say yes in the structures and who has the power to do that. And I want to mine them for that information, and I want to build those connections and build those relationships as much as possible. For example, at Amazon, just very briefly, I was working with a PA there who had trained 7 managers in a row, right? And that's the person I wanted on my side, because that's the person who knew all the structures and knew how that worked and knew how people were getting screwed and knew how to change it. So that's I'll stop there, but I think that's a really big next step, is just workplace mapping, starting a big board. Check.
Ted, go ahead.
I'm going to be unapologetically formulaic, but I would say build those relationships, everything that Brian said, and then find an issue that brings people together, and then turn that issue into a campaign. And if you want help turning an issue into a campaign, you should come to the next Secrets of a Successful Organizer training, which is going to be April 13th. I don't know if we have a link for that, but this would be the moment if I really...
April 10th.
April 10th.
April 10th.
April 10th.
My God.
I'll put the link in.
I almost had it there, but April 10th, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I mean, Brian was perfect. Absolutely everything he said, and what Ted said as well. But also patience. I mean, the first questioner had been there 2 weeks. Come on, guy, give yourself a break. Just try to settle into the job. This is, like I said, this is going to take a while. That too. And turning an issue into a campaign. Well, you know, there's 2 secrets workshops. One is on finding the natural leaders that Brian talked about, and then the one that Ted talked about, turning an issue into a campaign. One of the things to look for as an issue is when management takes something away. You know, when they want you to go backwards, when they are all of a sudden you're not getting your full break, or, you know, whatever it is. That tends to be the sort of, people have come to expect a certain level of horribleness at the workplace. When it gets more horrible, that's a good issue. And also, I just really agree with Nick when he talked about what a clarifying experience it is to work in a workplace. I mean, if you come from a middle-class background like I do, and you go into a blue-collar workplace, to, you know, find out that people may not see the world the same way that you do. And even if you don't stay in a certain workplace that you've gone into for your whole life, you will come out of it a better person. You will know more. I'm thinking of the time when I was an auto worker, and another socialist and I had put together a leaflet, and we were very proud of it, and we were handing it out. And I go upstairs to where my work area was, and nobody's talking about the leaflet. They're talking about some anatomically correct potholders or something, and giggling about that. And I was so pissed, you know, why aren't they paying attention to our leaflet? But I learned it's not that easy. You know, people come into it with all their own stuff, and you'll find out in intimate detail about their stuff.
Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the idea of people, you know, not seeing the world the way that maybe we want them to, right? Like, I think one thing that's really clear is, you know, people who work these really difficult jobs have very good reason to not see the world in some of these, like, kind of like very polite, very like PR oriented terms that, like, the more that they would define as being like politically left, as like a liberal left, right? Like the wealthier upper middle class, like liberal politics can be really fucking annoying, you know, pardon my language, if you're one of these people working in these jobs, because it's just like, I want to be able to laugh at the anatomically correct, coaster and make an off-color joke about it and not be scolded for that kind of thing. Or, like I do think that this sense of like being talked down to is like a really real phenomenon. And, working in a job like this, like that's kind of liberating in that way. You don't have to put up with some of the same like just like nonsense like double speak that I found in corporate life of like people will be really, really polite to your face, while also trying to just like completely rip you off and crush whatever movement you're trying to get going. So yeah, I do think that's a worthwhile lesson for all socialists is, which I know many people, have worked in these types of jobs, but it's been a long time for me since I've been in that type of environment. And I actually do really like it. It's kind of nice to just be back to basics as a worker.
Okay, going to go to next question from Jesse. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much. My name is Jesse Sharp. I live down in Medford. And I guess my question, so a couple of years ago, I was working as a housekeeper in Ashland, Oregon, and we had a whole cohort of everyone who worked there wanted to unionize. We were really solid with the exception of like one person in laundry. Everyone was like, yeah, we need a union. This is crazy. Our rooms are renting out $800 a night. We're getting paid minimum wage. We're getting overworked. And our owners are buying, I think they were buying their fourth house at that point in the hills of Ashland, right? So we were in a really good situation to unionize in that there was no question about analysis, We were all in the same boat. We were all getting paid minimum wage. And we started doing a lot of outreach, and we talked to pretty much all of the big locals that we could, many of whom sort of would say they're statewide organizations or the like, right? But we would, when we got responses, it was usually like, oh, well, we're busy right now, we'll talk about it later, or like, we don't really have somebody in Medford who can help you out, right? So we went through this process where we had a bunch of workers ready to unionize and no unions would take those workers. And then we saw the same thing. I worked with some bartenders in the same town a couple of years ago. And then more recently, working in, we just unionized my workplace as a nonprofit worker now. But even in that process of unionizing as a nonprofit, the major unions, when the nonprofit hired union busters, the major unions that also funded the nonprofit would not release statements backing the workers. And big shout out to DSA, because DSA did. But in that process, I guess, like, I'm just wondering, especially when we're talking about organizing not traditionally organized sectors or sectors that don't have high levels of representation, how do you confront, I think it's very difficult to start organizing your coworkers only to basically have them come to the realization that the unions aren't going to back them either because of their region or because of their sector. And I just wonder how you work around that or how we address that.
Is this all on me? Jesus. I don't have a magic answer for that, because that is very hard. You work hard to organize people into a union, and then, the higher levels of the union are not that great. Again, it's the slow, patient building. At some point you're going to have to take over the higher level of that union. And usually, often, even if you're not getting a lot of help from the regional office or whatever it is, you can still do a whole lot, in your local shop. I mean, the way Megan was talking about, break off a chunk. So I think when you're choosing your union to belong to, you really want to be careful with that, and try to find one where A, you're going to have a certain amount of local autonomy, and B, they're not going to be squashing you in things that you are trying to do. But I don't pretend to have an easy answer to that, because, you know, so many of our unions do suck. And that's what we're trying to change.
Keith, is that a direct response?
Yeah, keep it really quick.
Go ahead.
Similar experience in Portland in 2017. Reached out to a bunch of unions to try to get help organizing my workplace, which was also Amazon in 2017. And yeah, it wasn't there. I don't know how you deal with that. I guess what we did is we created the Amazon Worker Solidarity Campaign. So I think the solution is kind of DSA and forcing the hand of the unions, or just kind of going around. Like I said, you got to be aware of them. They'll try to co-opt you if you don't. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure how we go about it other than how we have been.
Jamie, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, my experience over the decades has been that the larger unions who have, you know, like AFSCME or SEIU, who have an industry-wide strategy, they have their eyes set on a particular set of workplaces that they want to organize. And if your workplace doesn't fit, they're not interested. Or, you know, but there are a number of unions, particularly those that have been shrinking in recent years because of automation, or, you know, like CWA, for example, who used to represent tons of phone company workers, is now, you know, branching out and taking on small shops. The same thing's true of ILWU, which is a great, you know, union with a radical tradition that decided to help bookstore workers organize, and then recently childcare workers organize, and even the machinists, you know, have taken on childcare. You know, these are small shops, so it's different now. As different unions who used to be these massive industrial unions are taking on smaller shops. But the other piece I wanted to mention, the other topic that just came up, Keith brought up Amazon, and it's clearly a target that is much bigger than any one union. I mean, even when the Teamsters for a Democratic Union and the United Teamsters United take over the Teamsters Union this year, or whenever it is, Amazon is still too big for even the Teamsters resources. It's going to take multiple huge unions to take on that behemoth, and that's going to be a real challenge. You know, that's the challenge ahead of us in the labor movement, to create the kind of CIO movement that can take on this huge behemoth. That's the small and the large of it, my perspective.
I have a quick direct response to that. I very much agree with what I think Keith kind of alluded to, which is that like DSA has a very special role to play in this regard. Because I remember when I was organizing in a different workplace, like, you know, I tried to get help from multiple established labor unions. You know, they didn't want to help. And the only one that did was the IWW, but like they didn't want to help us fight for a contract. And so I was like, oh my God, we don't, you know, it feels like we don't really have any good options, because, you know, I was a nonprofit worker. It was just like one single shop, you know, not a big company or anything. It was only like 20 workers or so. But it was like a pillar of the community that I lived in. And, you know, unionizing that community center would have been a really big shakeup in the community for, you know, like to have that presence of the labor movement. And like the only help that I could get was through DSA. And I think having us function as, you know, kind of I guess not exactly like one big union, but, you know, the like providing the resources that many labor unions don't want, like can't or don't want to provide, because like they are, you know, they have particular interests that don't always align with helping, you know, new organizers. And so I think what DSA has to offer is, obviously the trainings and a community of socialists who share a similar perspective about the labor movement and a similar organizing perspective, and also connections with other radical militant organizers in other labor unions. Okay, a question from YL, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm in an industry, in a particular workplace that's impossible to organize right now. So a lot of my energy as a socialist is going in DSA in the electoral working group. And my question's kind of geared around when doing the, in terms of what we're in the process locally of kind of thinking through and strategizing what particular area to focus on, whether it's like city council, county rate commissioners, state legislators. And so around some of that stuff, in terms of being able to pick candidates and campaigns from the electoral side that can kind of help support the rank and file work and kind of further make the connections to the labor unions, and kind of vice versa in terms of being able to begin to, win some layers of labor rank and file, as well as, broader unions, towards more, left-wing candidates. If folks have any thoughts around that, and I know this is kind of a separate, question, so if we don't want to spend a lot of time, but I'd love to at least flag it to maybe for us, for some of the folks who are very involved in labor work, to help inform our work locally around that electoral focus.
Nathan, if that's a direct response, go ahead.
Yes. One thing I recommend doing that's fairly easy is school board elections. If there's a elected school board in your area, it's often something that doesn't get a lot of attention, and so there won't be a lot of competition. And in Richmond, Virginia, 2 or actually 3 pro-education, pro-local socialists won school board seats recently, thanks to efforts of the teacher activists and trade union members, and so there was an effort among unions and teachers to ensure socialists or progressives on the school board. So that's really something that's really strategic, because it's fairly easy to do. If you just have a couple dozen volunteers, you can get people to vote in a school board ways. And people who, if you're running on a school board and you're like, yeah, we should increase teacher pay and we should, maybe not privatize schools, people will be welcome to that. So that's a really good thing to do. Thanks.
Any other direct responses on YL's question? Okay, if you have one, feel free to say in chat. I'm going to move to Terry. New question.
Hello. Well, first, a quick confession. Whenever faced with a choice between getting an honest job and getting another degree, you can probably guess which way I went. The bigger question of how do you put the boundaries on working class? Because specific question is, college is marketed as the pathway out of the working class. Community college level, certainly secondary level. So it's not surprising that there's some tension there between college-educated folks and unions. This is part of why the teachers' strikes are so exciting, because that sort of helps undermine the image of unions as strictly blue collar. I'm just wondering if you could talk to a little bit about the boundaries of what we consider to be working class and how we can address that issue. Check.
Well, if you're asking me, Terry, I don't know if talking about the boundaries of the working class is the best way to approach it. I think it's better to think about what are the more strategic sections of the working class. And as you alluded to, I mean, okay, back in the 70s, we picked all blue collar industries that had a direct effect on production or distribution: Teamsters, telephone workers, steel workers, auto workers. Teachers were not, on our horizon. But I think these days, people would be crazy if they didn't see teachers as, practically being the vanguard, at least, before the pandemic, and I'm sure going to pick it up again. So that it's not quite so, you don't have to be like I don't know what the word to say, a hard-boiled Marxist, where it's only the people who can throw the monkey wrenches into the gears of production would be your strategic sector. And I think in DSA, we need to really be flexible. And I mean, I'm all for national formations. I would love it if, DSAers everywhere decided to become teachers and other DSAers decided to go into logistics, especially UPS and maybe Amazon. But I also think we have to think locally and what makes sense where you are and what would be, where could we all get jobs together that would really make a difference here. And that's going to be different from place to place. And I also think we have to think about, what's sustainable, because the most effective way to organize is not just you go in as a salt and you come back out again when after something has happened. You stay there and you create relationships for years. I interviewed a telephone worker who went in with the intention of organizing, and she's been there over 20 years now. And I thought her quote was really great. Be sure it's a job that you like doing and you can do for a long time, because most of your time is going to be spent doing the work. I always emphasize it's great to have labor as your organizing thing, because it's not confined to weekends and after work. You can do it, while you're at work, but most of your time is going to be spent doing the work. So you have to pick something that you can actually stand doing and that your body can stand doing, and that you can survive on. You're probably not going to get a job making $7.25 an hour and stay there for a long time. So I don't know, I'm throwing in a lot of criteria, but the point is to be strategic in your thinking about where in the working class to organize.
Thank you, Jane. We're at time. We just raced through this hour and a half with some fabulous discussion and touching on most of the aspects of the rank and file strategy, socialists and the labor movement. And we want you all to look forward to this, the pamphlet that the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission will be producing at some, I don't know what the timeline is, Jane, but I've seen a recent draft. It looks fabulous, and a lot of these points and in more detail. Please consider getting involved with the DSA Labor Working Group, which is meeting, thank you, Laura, she put it in the chat, this Tuesday, 7 to 8:30, and go to our website for the agenda and the link. And again, thank you so much, Jane Slaughter, and thanks everyone for coming out today.
You guys ask great questions.
Thank you everyone so much for being here, and thank you so much, Jane. So good to hear from you and to talk to you.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Jane. Good to see you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
See you all at the Labor Working Group meeting.
We're going to talk more about the PRO Act at the labor working group meetings. All right.
Of course.